Hey, welcome along to our show for today. We are before a live audience of Mark Steyn cruisers from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, India, New Zealand, a few places outside the Commonwealth, such as the Czech Republic, and we are right here in Glacier Bay. Yeah, there's not a glacier in sight. The last one was so humiliated at the thought of being in the presence of our panel that it melted and just swept out into the Pacific. It has already drowned Tuvalu. That's gone. You don't have to wait till the year 2200. It's gone. So it's a desert outside the window. It's like the Sunni Triangle there, just a vast sandy wasteland. There's a couple of skulls, a vulture, wondering what is going to come along. It's amazing. The climate change is barreling out of control. That is what we are here to talk about. The National Park Service, in fact, came onto the ship, and the park rangers were peddling the usual alarmist line. They're as politicized as every other government agency is these days, and they declined to actually stick around to hear these three gentlemen, although I do believe they have called the National Park Service SWAT team. So if you hear the doors being kicked down, just duck and let them get a nice clean shot at our panel. We have with us the two guys who slew the most influential scientific graph of the 21st century. Governments from New Zealand to Canada mailed it to all their citizens, and among the people they made the mistake of mailing it to were Ross McKitrick and Steve McIntyre. And Ross and Steve actually took a serious look at the science behind Dr. Michael Mann's hockey stick graph and found it rather curious, to put it mildly. Full disclosure, Dr. Mann has been suing me in the District of Columbia Superior Court for 7 years now. I can't wait for the rise of the oceans to just rise up and wash the District of Columbia court system far out to sea, because... and we also have with us the man who runs the #1 climate website in the world, Anthony Watts of What's Up With That. You know, the funny thing, Anthony, is with climate change, it's the opposite of the hockey stick graph. It seems to kind of go up and down, ebb and flow, ebb and flow. And I thought the hysteria had gone away for a bit. And then Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez comes along with her Green New Deal. And with respect to our Indian cruisers here, foresees a grand bovine genocide in which all the sacred cows of the new religion are going to be slaughtered. And it gets taken seriously, and presidential candidates at least feel they can't ridicule it. Are we back in one of those climate change moments again?
Well, I think perhaps we are. You know, the funny thing about Alexandria is that she believes things that are patently untrue and does not blink an eye when someone brings it out in front of her. Just the other day, you may have seen this, she said that we wouldn't be having all these problems with the hurricanes, with people getting gas, if people just had electric cars. Well, golly. I seem to recall that power goes out when hurricanes happen, but you know, Yeah, that's beside
Yeah,
the point.
power goes out in New Hampshire if there's like a stiff breeze. So I wouldn't want to be recharging the electric car in some of those states. So it never, but it again in the bigger picture, it seems to me that this thing sort of peaked in the early years of this century. People are still deferring to it, but my sense is that. It's a kind of pseudo-urgency, and they're not really taking it seriously.
Most of it seems to me to be they're catering to their base. Their base is very, we have to do something, anything. And so they are coming up with schemes and schemes upon schemes to try to cater to their base, to make them, appease so that they will get votes. But almost every one of these schemes that they come up with, whether it's electric cars or more windmills or solar or whatever, has some kind of a downside. The bottom line is that our society has not succeeded based on this tiny little bit of renewable energy, and it cannot ever. We can't ever completely replace fossil fuels with these things that are only right now generating a couple of percentage points of electricity or whatever. It's just not possible. Yet they don't want to see this reality. And that's the quandary of it all.
What do you say, Steve, to this thing? You must have heard this a million times. That, and in fact, the park rangers up on deck were doing it.
Yeah, I've heard that.
The park rangers were doing it today. That the science is settled. There's a 97% consensus. 97% of the world's geniuses cannot be wrong, and people like you shouldn't even be permitted on the BBC or CNN or CBC or ABC or any of them to put any kind of contrary view.
One of the things to keep in perspective about the so-called cost of climate change is right now, if you add up all the disasters that are related to weather, they count for about 0.3% of GNP. And of that 0.3, that's all the hurricanes, all the floods, all the droughts. And that percentage of GNP has been declining over the past 100 years. So things are not getting worse. At the same time, listening to climate scientists, this is the worst of all possible periods in all of human civilization, and yet world poverty is at unprecedented low levels. People in India, there are huge middle class developed in India, in China, in Southeast Asia. So despite all the, so if climate change was really going to bite us hard, if 2 times CO2 was going to be biting us hard, it would already be biting us hard somewhere. And 0.3% of GNP isn't. And that 0.3% is all weather-related events. How much of that is attributable to climate change is only a fraction of that, maybe 10% of that. So to turn your economy upside down to economize on extreme weather events is a odd calculus indeed.
Ross, Steve has laid out various rational indicators there. And yet the funny thing is, in a sense, the argument is impervious to that. People would say to Steve, well, you're not a climatologist, so what you say doesn't matter. But when Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez says the world is going to end in 12 years, people think that is some kind of scientific consensus. In a way, we're in a metaphysical world here rather than a scientific one, aren't we?
Yeah, and one of the odd things I find is the discussion is always going on a couple of different planes. So in the academic world, there are actually serious discussions about this kind of point, that economists who look at renewable energy, for instance, even the ones who are much more alarmed about climate change than me, still don't like these policies because they cost far more than any benefits that can be attributed to them, even if you take the other side's argument at face value. And on the science side, there are a lot of serious debates on the kinds of issues Steve and I talked about and lots of others. But all of that happens on a plane that nobody sees and that doesn't really ever penetrate to the public consciousness. All we hear about in the public consciousness is what Greta Thunberg has to say this week. And it's sort of that level of craziness and beyond. And, AOC's 12-year prediction of the end, or Prince Charles's,
Yeah.
6 months to the end of the world.
He actually
18 months
said,
ago.
I think in fairness, Al Gore said 10 years. And the Prince of Wales actually calculated it more finely and said, I think it was 8 years and 7 months, which ended. I think the deadline was 3 years ago.
So you get the craziness level, but then what's odd is the people who do know better, who should say something, are intimidated into not saying anything. The one exception, though, and this one swallow doesn't make a spring, but the head of the World Meteorological Organization just last week made a speech where he began to warn people that the extremism on the alarmist side has gone too far, and scientists need to actually speak out against it. And okay, it's too little and far, far too late, but this situation where in private all these politicians know the craziness is making it impossible to talk about the issue rationally, and the scientists and other people, and so they just let it go. Unfortunately, they've hatched a monster that they can't control now.
Yeah, you mentioned Greta Thunberg, who is the latest manifestation of the movement. And in fairness, we were having a laugh at Al Gore and Prince Charles's expense, and that's always good, and I encourage all of you to do it with either of them. But Greta Thunberg, I mean, in fairness, one is the heir to the throne and the other is a former vice president. Greta Thunberg is a whatever she is, a 13-year-old, 9-year-old, 11-year-old Swedish schoolgirl who travels around the world being fawned on by prime ministers and presidents as she is, if you take the idea that climate alarmism is a religion, the idea of this like talismanic schoolgirl that no one dare criticize is in fact become the new perfect face of the movement. I mean, it is at a certain point, it's teetering on the brink of self-parody. Isn't it, Anthony?
I think it's already past the point of self-parody. I mean, people are stumbling all over themselves to come up with even greater and more dire announcements in a way that they think is going to captivate people. And people that generally don't think for themselves, well, they get frightened by these things. This schoolgirl that you spoke of, she's quite frightened of the things that the adults have told her. And that's why she feels compelled to do these things. In my view, some of the things that the adults are telling children these days verges on child abuse.
Well, let's actually look at what that boils down to. Steve, as far as most of us understood it until Michael Mann came along, there was a medieval warm period in which in places where one certainly would not dare to drink any local wine now, in parts of northern England, they had vineyards. The University of East Anglia, where they have that Climate Research Institute that all the ClimateGate emails came from, they had vineyards there. I would be in favor of demolishing the Climate Research Institute and actually growing a little Chateauneuf du Michael Mann or something there instead. And then the medieval warm period ended and we went to the Little Ice Age. And then we came out of the Little Ice Age, which is what basically enabled the settlement of Canada, because Canada is a country where it's winter for 10 months of the year. It would be winter for 11 and a half months of the year if we hadn't come out of the Little Ice Age. There wouldn't be a Canada. And then we had these like little 30-year warming trends, 30-year cooling trends, basically through the 20th century. Is there anything in that to get alarmed over?
Not yet, not right now. I view the medieval warm period as part of a much longer decline from about 10,000 years ago. And Glacier Bay, where we are, is an interesting location for thinking about periods like the medieval warm period and the early Holocene and the Big Ice Age. when the Captain Vancouver arrived at Glacier Bay in 1799, there was a glacier that went all the way out to the ocean, so that all these 100 kilometers that we've cruised up today was full of a glacier, and that has retreated about 100 kilometers in the last 200 years. So that's been going on before SUVs were invented. But what people also lose track of is that for the 12,000 years before that, there was no glacier going out to the ocean. There was a glacier, but it hadn't gone that far. So in the medieval warm period, there was a outwash plain in front of a glacier that was about 40 kilometers up fjord. And there were, the Tlingits had settlements there, and then the glacier advanced, bulldozed all the gravels in that 40 kilometers out to the ocean. And then when it retreated, we have the scenic inlets that we have today. There were similar scenic inlets 10,000 years ago. 8,000 years ago, there were forests growing in part of it. So there have been lots of changes over any scale of time you think about, and dramatic changes, so that when people nowadays that look at the changes in the 20th century, they are not so large compared to past periods. And the medieval warm period was better for human civilization. The Roman warm period, better yet. Holocene warm period, better yet.
Right. And just to pick up on that, Ross, the argument of these national park guys is to respond to things like what Steve has just said by saying, yes, that's all very well, but it defies logic to think that we could have had the Industrial Revolution and to think that the people in this room today who 100 years ago would all have had horse and buggy and now have these big gas-guzzling vehicles could not. It's impossible for them not to have had an impact on the climate. And their position, therefore, is that you don't get distracted by historical trends or anything. It's impossible to believe that what's happened since the Industrial Revolution could not have impacted the climate.
Yeah, and it's a giant leap from saying conceivably, likely humans have an impact on their environment to humans drive the whole process with no natural variability in the system.
Right.
Everything that Steve described is obviously natural variability, which to this day isn't all that well understood. And then you have superimposed on that whatever influence humans have, which as soon as people start trying to study it, that's actually statistics. So when Steve and I were working on the hockey stick stuff, our training is in statistics. So people were saying, you guys shouldn't be talking about this because you're not climatologists. And then among themselves in the ClimateGate emails, the climatologists are saying, well, we don't actually know much statistics, so it's really hard to follow what they're doing. And that appears all through this literature. Climatology is a lot like economics in the sense that it's the analysis of data.
Yeah.
So this question of trying to figure out what's the human component in it is a very difficult one. And what I object to people like the park rangers, just being completely confident. They've got it all figured out. Everything prior to 1980 was Mother Nature. Everything after that is us. And it's all bad.
Yeah.
And it would be fine if it was Mother Nature melting glaciers. That's just the wonderful pageantry of the Earth.
Yeah.
But if it was us, then it's a crisis. The United States is an interesting country because it's the one country in the world where you can choose any of the Earth's climates to live in. You can live in the tropics or the Arctic. You can live in the desert, rainforest, anywhere you want. And if you look and see where people in the U.S. are moving to, they're leaving the cold parts of the country and they're moving
Yeah.
to the warm, wet coastal regions where occasionally they get extreme weather, and
Yeah.
they're calling that such a great, they're paying big money to do that.
Yeah, yeah.
So they're exposing themselves to the worst case climate model scenario
No.
and calling it a great benefit.
Yeah, a couple of fellows called Mr. and Mrs. Obama did that. They just, I think, they spent $14 million on property that's supposed to be underwater in the next 10 years. I don't understand that. It is, as you say, everybody moves. In America, you move from the cold parts to the warm parts. You can't do that in Canada because there aren't any warm parts. But you raise, actually, when you talk about statistics, you guys know statistics, and yet you are hammered by the climate guys for applying your skill in statistics to the hockey stick. And I wondered, Anthony, when you get right down to it, people say, unless you're a climatologist or a 9-year-old Swedish schoolgirl, you've got no right to talk about this issue at all. What actually is a climatologist? Because when I look at this hockey stick, which is assembled from tree rings and temperature records and ice cores, Michael Mann doesn't go out and collect tree rings in the Gaspé Peninsula in Quebec. He's relying on some guy who went out and found some tree rings there 30 years earlier or whatever. What actually, this scientific purity that attaches to the term climatologist, if it isn't actually the processing of data and statistics, what is it that a climatologist does?
Well, surprisingly, there is no degree program at any university for a degree in climatology, or at least there didn't used to be.
Right.
In fact, the leading people, Dr. Mann, for example, did not have a degree in climatology. He got a degree in meteorology and mathematics. And it's the same thing for Dr. James Hansen, who ran NASA, who originally started the whole scare back in 1988. He was in astrophysics and so forth, and mathematics. These folks don't have degrees in climatology. So then when they say, well, you're not a climatologist, you can't talk about it, well, neither are they. They don't have a piece of paper that says that. But I know the state climatologist of California very well, the former one, James Goodrich. And he is a man who pores over numbers. That's his entire life, really. And he looks at rainfall, and he looks at temperature, he looks for trends. Basically, he's a lot like a stockbroker. He's looking for trends in data, and he's using mathematical tools to pull out those trends and figure out what might happen in the future. That's basically what a climatologist does. And most of these climatologists, as you point out, don't actually get out of the office and do their own work. They're looking at numbers that have been gathered by other people. And that brings us into the temperature record. I'm not just a guy that runs a website. I've actually done research on my own, like these two fellows. One of the things I did was look at the temperature record for the United States. I looked at over 1,200 stations in the U.S. Climatological Network, Historical Climatological Network. And what I found, based on the standards published by NOAA, 90% of them did not meet their own standards for siting, meaning they were too close to buildings or air conditioner exhaust or runways,
Right.
things like that. Speaking of which, how many people here have flown through O'Hare Airport? Okay, on your luggage tags, it says ORD, and you think that stands for O'Hare, right? It does not. It stands for Orchard Field. That's what it was back in the dawn of aviation.
Right.
It was a grass field, and there were orchards on either side. They measured the temperature there then because they had to for aviation, and they still do today. But what's changed is now Chicago O'Hare is a megaplex of concrete and asphalt and jet exhaust, and the temperature is much higher. And you talked earlier about, well, you think all of these things that we've done as mankind to change our society has had an effect. Well, there it is, right there.
Yeah. Yeah, and their reaction to that, Steve, and this is going on all over the world. They're doing it not just in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, is they took the temperature when it was an orchard at O'Hare in 1909, and they take it again 2009 when it's an international airport, And instead of thinking, well, maybe there's a difference between having a thermometer in the middle of an orchard and a thermometer in the middle of runway 6, they think that there's got to be a problem with there's a problem with the orchard temperature, that it isn't cold enough. So they're actually revising the past to make the past appear colder than it was in relation to the present.
I'm going to pass this one to Ross, who's much more interested in temperature data than I am. I've mostly been interested in the proxy data and the tree rings and those things.
Okay, you take that one, Ross.
It's a real problem if you want to look up a temperature record. For instance, I looked up Juneau Airport before coming here just to see. What you'll see online looks like an upward sloping line, but if you look really closely, this is on the NASA website, there's a very faint line behind it. And so I printed it out, used a pen to trace it over. That faint line is what's called the unadjusted data. And it goes up and down, but it's basically flat. The line they want you to see is called the adjusted data. And that's the one that, as you say, they decided that prior to 1950 or so, nobody knew how to read a thermometer properly, so they're going to... Now, maybe those adjustments are all valid, but you have to take their say-so for it. And I don't like this situation where the data is coming from people who say, we're going to keep the actual data hidden, we're just going to show you the data after we've adjusted it, and trust us that the adjustments are valid. This question of, well, how do you know your adjustments are valid? That was one of the first ones that I got into back before the hockey stick days. I did a couple of papers with Pat Michaels where we just tested these spatial patterns of trends to see whether they correlate with things they're not supposed to correlate with, like population growth and GDP growth. And they do. They strongly correlate with these indicators of economic activity. And for the most part, like we publish these in climate journals, we got the IPCC to report on it and summarize it, but the people who work with the data, in the end, they can just ignore it. They like the answers the data gives them as they have it, and they don't really have an incentive to dig into this question. But I think it's a big question. As Anthony points out, that's just for the US, but it's even worse in other countries around the world, all through the third world where the only thermometers are at airports. I think there's big data quality problems that make it hard to study this.
Well, let me ask you something more basic then, Ross. From a scientific point, is adjusted data on this scale, is adjusted data a thing? Is it actually a legitimate activity?
Well, sure. We use adjusted data in economics too. You know, quarterly adjusted, seasonally adjusted. As long as you know what the adjustment is, as long as it's transparent and it's.
Well, what you talk about seasonal adjustment there that economists will do for employment figures, which I think would mean that, for example, in the summer you might have a lot of seasonal agricultural labor that you wouldn't have in the depths of winter. So if you would think that just meant your economy was booming generally, and it doesn't, it's a specific seasonal thing. What are these adjustments about?
Let me respond to, because I think the term adjustments gets a too negative connotation in many cases. I'll give you an example where adjustments are useful and important. There's a very popular long-term graph of oxygen 18 data in Greenland, which shows very level, sort of is interpreted as temperature and shows very level temperatures for 10,000 years. About 8 years ago, a scientist named Vinther observed that the elevation of the Greenland ice sheet had decreased several hundred meters over that period, and that needed to be taken into account in interpreting the oxygen 18 data as temperature. So he looked at other benchmarks where glaciers hadn't changed elevation, and from that determined that there had been a very considerable decline in oxygen 18 temperatures over the Holocene, 4 degrees, 5 degrees in the past 10,000 years. So it gives a very different understanding of the period, and one that is more scientifically informative than the data that is not adjusted for elevation change.
Well, but we know that the difference there is that we're adjusting for elevation change, which is something one can grasp and take into account and relate to the overall trend line. What are we adjusting for when at NOAA or the Meteorological Office in the UK or in Australia, what are they adjusting for when they're doing all this adjusting, which only seems to come one way, Anthony?
They're adjusting for changes in the data. And we get this viewpoint that science is pristine, that climate science is pure. But the reality is that it is not. The data that's being gathered, temperature data at the surface, is being done in a rather haphazard way, and has been for over 100 years. In 1892, the United States Weather Bureau was formed by an act of Congress, and their main mission back then was to forecast for agriculture, because we were essentially mostly an agrarian society back then. And so they set up weather stations all over the United States, and that was then copied throughout the world. And it was called the Cooperative Observer Network. And back then they had to put things on paper because they didn't have cell phones or, computers or whatever. So every month they would record everything on a sheet of paper, the high and low temperatures, how much rainfall there was, how many days were overcast, that sort of thing. And they would send it into the National Climatic Data Center. The problem is that human observers make mistakes. And so sometimes they would transpose 60 and make it a 90 or something like that. So they would look for those kinds of things and fix those kinds of things. That's a valid adjustment. But then there was things like, the observer would retire and they would move the station. A perfect example of that is in Lampasas, Texas. We had an observer that was out at a farm who was recording temperature, and this was an official climate station being used to come up with the national average, by the way. And everything was going along fine with this one observer, but when he retired, they moved it to a radio station downtown in Lampasas, Texas. It was on the concrete and asphalt right next to the highway. And the temperature spike went zoop, like this over a period of a few months. And that got into the climate data, and so they try to adjust that. And so all these adjustments are trying to fix these perceived problems and real problems in the data. The problem is that the temperature data we have for the last 100 years is really messy. It's not pristine, it's not pure, and it does require some adjustment to try to fix it. The problem is almost every adjustment that's being made by the government scientist causes the trend to increase. We never see one that causes the trend to decrease. And in fact, they take out some stations that are considered too cold. Crater Lake, Oregon, for example, was removed from the database. Well, it's too cold. Why? Seriously, I'm not joking. I'm not joking. But here's the real rub.
Well, because for most of us who have watched this thing at a distance, what happened was, around the turn of the century, there were a lot of very confident climate models that were issued by the professionals. And those climate models were fairly scary. We now are approaching the end of the second decade of the 21st century, and those models largely did not pan out. And to some of us, it seems that the climate establishment is trying to align reality with the model. So because the model is a dud, the model is a bust, but if we take the actual temperature record and the other indicators, we can force the planet to align with our model of it. Are we dealing with serious high-level scientific corruption, Ross?
One of the, sort of picking up on Anthony's point, when you know you're working with really messy data, what you should be is just very cautious and humble about the conclusions you draw. And that gets lost when these graphs are drawn and when they announce this year is the warmest year ever and they're talking about, hundredths of a degree difference in a data set that's as Anthony pointed out, it's hopelessly noisy. Ironically, though, even if you just take the data at face value, the surface data and the satellite and weather balloon data, and compare it to what the models say should be happening, that's another issue that opens up, that the models run hot compared to the data. Right. John Christie, who state climatologist in Alabama, he and I did a paper last year. We picked a level of the tropical atmosphere where the models all say greenhouse gases should have a really strong effect, much stronger than at the surface. This is where it should just be glowing red and very vivid based on greenhouse gases. And it's a level that's monitored by weather balloons, and it's not affected by all these problems at the surface. Yeah. So we've got good measurements of it. So how do the models and data match up there? We have 120 runs from all the different models. Every single run over the 50-year time span that we had available, every single run from every model overstated the warming. Right. And in 2/3 of the case, the difference was statistically significant. So right. We wrote this up for a journal. One of the referees admitted he was astonished that the gap was that bad. And we published it. We didn't really know how the modeling community would react. Actually, I kind of figured how they would react, which was just ignore. Like, no interest in this whatsoever. But we look at that and think it's obvious that this suite of models runs too hot. They're overstating the effect on the climate, unless they have some really good explanation about why this discrepancy could hold. But again, that is if we just say, all right, we have messy data, we'll just use it anyway. And even on that plane, we run into this problem. The models are running hot. And ironically, the next generation of models that will come out for the next IPCC report, they're running even hotter than the current generation model. They have a higher climate sensitivity value. And on that score, when there was a discussion in Science magazine about this, some of the modelers themselves are starting to get a little bit nervous that this is starting to look kind of fishy, that they don't know why their models are running that hot, but it's kind of going in the wrong direction for them.
It's been going on for a long time now, and you would have thought if there was, without wishing to impugn anyone's integrity, that someone would actually, inside the group, as it were, inside the groupthink, would be wanting to do this. I know, Steve, you don't like the ideological component to this that has come along. You said to me, I don't know, I hope I'm not giving anything away, but you said to me you're an engineer by profession, and you described yourself to me as you were a fairly conventional Trudeaupian liberal until the hockey stick caught your eye, at which point you immediately moved into the category of right-wing madman. How did this field become, having been on the receiving end of it, how did it become so partisan?
That's an interesting question. Well, I guess the academic communities start off by being very partisan. And they have adopted a campaign, I think, of not trying to persuade their opponents, but to deprecate their opponents, and I guess, and elect, essentially, I suppose, adopt the Constantine strategy of converting the emperor of Rome and thereby converting the Roman Empire to Christianity rather than actually any of the citizens. So they would perceive if they get Obama or an Obama 2.0 as president and install them in, that's their strategy rather than to persuade people. My own take on that is that if climate is a big problem, then it would take a consensus of the entire society to implement the vast scale of changes required, so that it's important to persuade the most rational right-wing people of the problem, and they've chosen not to do that. I think that's a mistake. Why they don't do it, I don't know.
There was a little glimmer of a trend a few years ago At one point, everything was very sharply divided. There's an interesting paper that's just, well, not interesting, actually, it's completely uninteresting, but it's a revealing paper which attempts to track the media footprint of what they call climate scientists and then the other group who are the deniers. And that's always the way it's been presented, the scientists and the deniers. But there was this interesting period a few years ago when other groups came. There were younger scientists, like 20 years younger than Michael Mann and Phil Jones and co., who were known as lukewarmers and who were more open to alternative theories on this. What's become of all that?
Okay. I would say that the ClimateGate emails interrupted any possibility of rational discussion. The climate science community, rather than engaging in any introspection as to the bad attitudes and bad conduct that was displayed in the ClimateGate emails, chose to whitewash the scientists that were in the emails and to blame their critics. And so, and since then, the fatwa against skeptics, skeptics of even the mildest element in the canon, like how you calculate principal components, is much more strictly enforced than it was prior to ClimateGate. And I think that the failure of the various inquiries to actually inquire contributed to that. So rather than resolving any of those issues, they made them worse.
Yeah, that's was an interesting and revealing reaction in itself, Anthony. I mean, Michael Mann, in his various lawsuits, always claims to have been pronounced innocent by whatever it is, 8, 9, 12, 15 different inquiries by parliaments and government bodies and all the rest of it. And yet when you look at them, those bodies themselves actually seem to regard their job as being to protect the official narrative of climate rather than to investigate any wrongdoing.
That's true. These societies, they're very small, cliquish, and there's a lot of ego involved. Climate science has a huge amount of ego in the top echelons of some of these people, and their ability to accept criticism, you would think as a scientist, would be there. But they will only accept criticism from peers they consider equals, and sometimes not even then. In the ClimateGate emails, some of Michael Mann's peers were criticizing him, saying, some of this data you're using really isn't appropriate and doesn't really say what it's supposed to be saying or what you think it's saying, and yet he wouldn't even listen to them. Yeah. And so, yeah, there's a lot of ego involved in climate science, not only about I'm right and you're wrong, but there's also a lot of we're saving the world, so just shut up and do what we tell you.
Yeah, that's actually central to it too, because you've got here basically a scientific narrative that is bolstered by officialdom, by governments, and actually by transnational institutions. The hockey stick benefited from the fact that it was basically the United Nations' favorite scientific graph, Ross. Do you think that the imprimatur of officialdom has actually corrupted what these guys are doing?
Yeah, I think, well, it's had two contrasting effects. On the one hand, it doesn't really help them that they've got all these celebrities and UN officials and people flying constantly around the world to land, tell you to stop flying and using fossil fuels, and then they take off again to their next.
Prince Harry did that 4 times by private plane in 11 days. He flies in to tell you not to catch a cheap tourist flight to Florida, and then he flies out again.
But that issue of the imprimatur of IPCC, but also the scientific societies, I think that's a source of a lot of the problem for them. I got into an online debate once with the head of the American Meteorological Society. They were proposing to put out a statement on climate change. And in the comment section of a blog Roger Pilkey Sr. used to run, I'd written a little piece there saying, in the economic societies that I belong to, the American Economic Association, Canadian Economic Association, it's in the Constitution. They will never issue position statements.
Right.
And specifically, they point out this is to preserve the intellectual freedom of their members.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I said, you guys shouldn't be issuing these position statements because you're now creating a class system in your organization. There are the people that, well, there's the ones that get to write the statement, and then they're the ones that agree with it. But then you might have half of your membership disagree with the statement, but they're now going to be driven into a kind of second-class citizenship and silence. So I also said, if you really insist on putting this out, take a survey of your members and let us see how many actually agree with it. So the president of the society, he was a bit baffled by this, but he said, no, I think the public expects of us to issue statements to, let them see what it is that we know and avail themselves of our wisdom. And he wasn't receptive to that. But to me, that's exactly what's happened now. These scientific societies have put out statements that I'm sure don't command universal assent within their organizations, but they won't survey their members. But for people like Judith Curry, as you've seen, who step up and say, I actually disagree with some of what's said here, and I think we need to debate this more. She is instantly relegated to second-class citizenship and eventually drummed out of the field. I think that's been very toxic for their profession.
Yeah. Yeah.
I want to step in here with an anecdote or an incident that illustrates rather forcefully how the interaction of an official agency, the IPCC, with scientists occurred to affect how a message was portrayed. And this occurred in the ClimateGate emails. And in one of the hockey stick graphs that you're concerned with
Right.
for your sins, one of the and there was a famous email where Phil Jones talks to Mike Mann about using a Mike's nature trick to hide the decline. And many of you have probably heard this phrase. It was on national television. It was even on Jon Stewart. What the decline was is that there were 3 temperature reconstructions that they wanted to show in this graph. One of them, Mann's, went up, and another one of them, Keith Griffiths, went down in the last part of the 20th century. And they presented this graph with one reconstruction going up and one reconstruction going down. And the chief authors of IPCC looked at this and they thought, well, this really this isn't going to scare anybody, or they're not going to think that these reconstructions are any good. So one of them wrote to Mann and the authors and says, well, this Briffa reconstruction rather dilutes the message, doesn't it? And Mann agreed, said, well, yes, of course it does. And he said, in fact, I would really want to be, I'm the last person that would want to, quote, give fodder to the skeptics. So what they did in the final, so Mann then said, well, and Mann and Briffa caucused, I guess, outside the emails and developed a solution. What they did was they chopped off 50 years of data that went down and published the graph with the Briffa series ending in 1940 or 1950, tucked the endpoint under a barrage of other graphs, and then the final graph went up and everything went up. Yeah. So the one that went down mysteriously disappeared. So this ought to have, so what I thought would have attracted controversy was the role of senior officials in getting the scientists to produce a graph that suited their message. But there was absolute radio silence on that topic.
No, and that's actually very interesting. When the phrase you use, diluting the message, that doesn't actually seem to have a lot to do with scientific research, but the back and forth in the emails about diluting the message and stuff is very revealing. We're going to take some questions from our audience. I think we have Erin and Enoch downstairs with the microphones and Laurie upstairs. Let's start. Have you got a question? Have we got a question up in the gallery from the cheap seats? Laurie, you got any questions up there? Wow. This is a complicated trend line. Laurie's been going up and down, up and down. It's way more sophisticated than the hockey stick, that trend line. Yep.
Ross touched on that the first tonight. He talked about a craziness level that doesn't get reached by the people who have something to say. And I want to relate that to the CNN marathon, where it's easy to want to dismiss the Democrat candidates as ridiculous. I don't think we should dismiss them. I think they've got their finger on something. They have identified an issue which I think they are convinced can get them the White House. And the reason for that is that, as you have all pointed out, we get bombarded on a daily basis by the message. And that's the only one they hear. Now, the Trump administration is doing great things by rolling back some of the measures at the EPA, but they should be concerned about the upcoming election. And unless the message that is being heard in schools, universities, churches, national parks is challenged, all the people are going to vote to save the nation, the planet. This morning, after what we heard, which was really painful, there was a woman behind me who said to her husband, you know, the sad thing is that when our grandchildren get to be our age, they won't see this because it won't exist anymore.
Right.
Now, the people are going to vote along those lines. So
Yeah.
my question to you is, there were a few proposals which I think were going to address this. There was one about the blue team, red team. It was scuttled. There was one about a commission that was going to be led by William Happer with people like Judith Curry and Richard Linson and Roy Spencer and so on. What has happened to that commission?
Yeah, that's as Will Happer, who I had the pleasure of sitting next to at some god-awful Senate hearing in the United States a couple of years back, and then was appointed to this governmental body by President Trump. Does actually any of that make a difference? Or are we now... has climate alarmism, in effect, become the environment itself, the environment in which we raise our young people? And we've done jokes about the Democrats, but if there were a Green Party in the United States, it might be like Green parties all over the continent. They get elected to Parliament. In places like Germany, they're very strong. In that sense, is the political argument lost, Ross?
Well, a few things there. So Will Happer was appointed to the National Security Council by President Trump, and it was a base from which he could try to get a group together to do an investigative report of some of the government's own climate research. And it appears that countervailing forces within the White House itself scuttled it, and the advisory group around the president were evenly split, and so nothing has happened. And another issue is what's called the endangerment finding, which is the basis for the EPA to regulate CO2 emissions. Early in the new administration, people were really pushing Pruitt to begin a process of reversing the endangerment finding, and they chickened out from that. In that sense, the artillery or the ammunition that they could have had to push back against some of the regulatory agenda, they haven't been able to come up with it. The gentleman, though, makes a good point that I suspect people don't quite realize how pervasive climate alarmism is in the school system, or maybe you do. Maybe you hear from your kids and grandchildren. In popular culture, it's really all the way through. So to the point that it has become almost a default position for a lot of people. And it still runs up against the barrier that when people say, okay, you win, we have a climate crisis, what do you want me to do?
Yeah.
And then, say, well, I want you to give up all your fossil fuels and quit your job and have nothing.
Yeah.
And so when they announce the policy plan, that's where they still run into trouble. But I do think that there is going to be a great deal of difficulty rebalancing this discussion on a broad scale just because of how pervasive alarmism has become.
But that's a bit like cheap grace, I always feel. I mean, it's easy to, in a way, it's easier to save the planet than save your rotten, dysfunctional school district or your rotten little town where all the factories have closed. It's to say, okay, I'm sorry, I can't save my school district or my town or my county because I'm too busy saving the planet. Well, what are you doing to save the planet? Well, I went to a rock concert where Leonardo DiCaprio introduced Sting singing something about the rainforest. I mean, that's the easiest kind of activism on the planet, isn't it? Let's have a question from down here, and I think Erin, maybe the lady at the back there, if you can get over there.
Hello, I'm one of those beleaguered Canadians, and we are facing an election in which we have a prime minister who's eviscerated our economy, and we are trying to fight back from a conservative point of view, but we're not getting anywhere, and even mentioning the fact that we want to talk about the issue gets us practically hung, drawn, and quartered in the public square. So has anybody got any ideas on how one might push back, or is there any inkling anywhere of any successful ways to counter these? Because the consequences are incredibly serious. We might none of us may be on this trip next year because we may all be impoverished and riding horses around the city.
Well, Justin Trudeau is incredibly anti-Alberta, anti-oil sands, anti-all that. But it is interesting, Anthony, that there is a line that politicians cross at their peril. Monsieur Macron thought he could say the sort of things that young Justin does, and he found himself with all these gilets jaunes in the street protesting every weekend. Down in Australia, the Labour Party thought it was cruising to victory on fanatical climatism and got the shock of its life and a totally unexpected election loss, at least in part due. It seems to be that when it goes from just prostrating yourself before the climate gods in general to actually saying, okay, now you're going to have to pay this much more in tax. When it becomes something concrete, people check out of it.
They do, and there was a poll that was conducted by the UN on their website over the past several years, and it talked about the major problems that the population of the world saw, and they wanted them to be ranked. And climate change came in almost dead last. It really did, and that was the UN. But, you talk about people prostrating themselves to this god of climatism. What's really going on in a lot of cases with the scientist and with the politician is something called noble cause corruption. They believe that they're saving the planet, and therefore the end justifies the means. And so we'll get there by inflating the models, we'll get there by creating scary scenarios, we'll get there by scaring school children and making them think that they have no future. And that's what's been going on, and it's all because of noble cause corruption, and it's a very, very sad thing, and it's something that has poisoned a good portion of our youth today.
Let's take a question from over there, Enoch. There's a man frantically waving his arm. We may have to call security if he waves it any more frantically.
Yes, sir. Thank you for taking my question. I'm Tom Stevens. My dissertation in 1972 was on climate effects on the greenhouse tomato production.
Right.
Okay? So I don't know nothing about climatology. I'm not an academician, but there's such a thing as, I quit the American Association for the Advancement of Science when they came out in about 1991. It said official policy for the ASSS was there is climate change, man's causing it, okay? I sent them a letter. I used to be a contributor, not paid more than like $200 a year, but I gave them $500 extra up until that point. The problem is we have grants that are distributed by peer review. And if you don't tote the party line, you ain't gonna get no grant. So there's a big part of the problem, in my opinion, but I've watched and observed and seen, and that if you cut out all these grants for all these highly skilled and intelligent folks, because if you do not write a grant that says, oh God, man, we're gonna be dead in 17 minutes, you're not gonna get a grant. So I call them grant prostitutes. That's cleaning it up from WHORE. But
There is. Well, I've always get it because people always say whenever you say anything that isn't peer reviewed, it has no value in the scientific debate. And even when you do have things that have been peer reviewed, as all three of you have done, it doesn't count because for some reason it's not the right kind of peer review, or you're the kind of guys that have no peers, so no peers can be found to review you. I look at this system and it seems obviously corrupt and completely preposterous. Am I wrong, Steve?
I think you're being sort of as over eloquent. Look, most scientific journals work. Nobody is. There's peer review in biochemistry journals, and lots of fights between one biochemist and another biochemist, and they get mad at their peer reviewers, and yet the discipline continues to grow and flourish. I think the unique thing in climate science is that it's a bit of a mix between, there's a certain hard science element to it, but there's also an element of sociology or gender studies to it, and so there's a qualitative element to it that lends itself to bias, and so it's hard to, and they also always have their eye on being cited in the next IPCC report, which is a political document. So we have an entire large industry generating more and more alarmist articles. I mean, even and every topic within the industry has to genuflect towards climate change. I once read an article that was written by a Chinese scientist in 1973 in the period of Chairman Mao. And at the end of it, he closed with a peroration that his work had been inspired by the teachings of Chairman Mao. And it was otherwise, I mean, the rest of it was a sober article. And I mean, you have that in the climate sciences. You can have some article on the mating habits of beetles, and it ends up being with a peroration to climate change at the end.
Right.
And I think you can sort of see past what is the Chairman Mao type genuflection to the actual article.
So if you discount those little flourishes which they are obligated to put in for the great leader or for the great climate change alarmists, the underlying science can still be quite sound.
Yeah.
Okay, you'd agree with that, Anthony?
Well,
No.
In some cases, yes. You know, science for the most part has done tremendous things for us. We live in a fantastic world today. You think of what the world was like 100 years ago. Trips like this, what we're doing right this moment, would not have been possible, or easily done anyway. But I think really what's happened with science in general was outlined by President Eisenhower during his farewell address in 1961. He talked about then, and everybody's probably heard this, the military-industrial complex. Be worried about that because of the budgetary things associated with that and all of the power they were accumulating. But what most people don't know is that in the very next paragraph after he talked about the military-industrial complex, he talked about the fact that there was a danger of science becoming beholden to funding. And that's what's happening today. All of the science that we're getting about climate change is coming from the government, and the government doles out the money. And unless there's a problem, unless we've got a future problem that we have to solve, the money doesn't come. That's really, in a nutshell, what's going on here, where the science has become very, very beholden to grants.
Let's have another question from the gallery, Laurie. We've got some serious arm flapping going on up here. Take off! You look like you're about to fly down and join us. Give it a go. Laurie's beetling over.
Thanks for the opportunity to put my solution to the problem. And this is something that the Mark Steyn Club could start. And this would be a worldwide petition. I envisage it in Australia, but I'm not sure quite how it would work elsewhere. And this is an opt-out petition. So I envisage in Australia, we'd have 1 million online signatures to opt out of any of my tax going to subsidise wind or solar power at all forever. So what you do is we all sign up to this petition, we petition the government and demand that our taxes don't go to fund this, and then on our tax return we have a little box to tick. If you tick the box, then you get let out of all of the subsidy costs. If you don't tick the box, then they're lumbered on your tax. So I think, number one, that would be attractive to people to sign up to, and number two, I think that it would actually might have a benefit.
Yeah, I'll ask the guys what they think about that, because we're dealing here with the core realities of political activism, which is that the people who are for something generally tend to be more motivated than the people who are against it, Ross. So that the people who are in favour of all the climate alarmism, well, you saw it at the G7. With the exception of President Trump, it doesn't really matter whether governments are conservative or socialist or whatever. They're all in favour of signing up to. They all went to the ocean warming workshop, except President Trump. He sat that out. He went and strolled the nude beaches of Biarritz or whatever, which is a far more useful way to spend your time. But that's the difference, isn't it? The people who want this stuff are more energized than the people who think it's a lot of hooey.
Yeah, the specific suggestion wouldn't work in Ontario, where I come from, because they very cleverly built the subsidy system right into the electricity price. So they can say, well, we're not actually subsidizing it. It's just you pay this surcharge on your electricity price to cover it. It is odd, the number of countries, including Canada, but also the US, where there's a big investment in wind and solar, even in places where I can't imagine people ever voted for it. Like it's one of these. There must be a PowerPoint presentation out there that's the most incredibly persuasive presentation in the world, because they go and everyone from the governor of Texas to Frau Merkel went for it, and they start investing in these things, even though everyone who works in the field will tell them you'll be subsidizing it forever. They'll break down much quicker than they're saying. This will wreck your electricity system because it's unstable and intermittent, and you won't even reduce emissions because you have to now build all these natural gas plants to run backup. And yet, it's this unstoppable force around the world. So no matter where you go, you see the wind turbines up all over the place. I guess like so many other things, I see it all happening. I just don't remember when we voted for it and how we vote against it. So I'm not the person to ask because I don't understand where it all arose from.
I'm glad that the wind solar point was brought up because that was something that wasn't we didn't touch on before, and yet is one of the very fundamental planks of the climate activist movement is that nuclear is bad and wind and solar are good, and yet wind and the limitations of wind and solar they can't power more than a micro fraction of a modern society. The only technology that has any potential is the large footprint, no carbon source of energy is nuclear. And until the climate science community has by and large been anti-nuclear activists. It doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense in terms of their supposed concern about temperature change, because if at that point you'd sort of say, okay, we'll eat whatever objections we had to nuclear and adopt it as a as a solution. And I think on the climate skeptic side, there's a large number of skeptics who don't particularly believe that the prospects are that bad, but are not so confident that they're right that they would say, okay, if we're doing something sane, we're like nuclear, we're okay with that. But the climate science community has been leaders in the anti-nuclear movement, and for that, I think they deserve far more shame or blame if it is a big problem than any of the skeptics.
Well, what about something like California, where they talk about mandating solar panels on all new home construction? That is doing nothing other than advertising your moral virtue. It does nothing for energy generation, does it?
The entire thing is virtue signaling.
Yeah.
But that way, at least you'll have sort of a billboard above your house that is signaling your virtue.
No.
But perhaps they could have some neon trim with the solar panels.
Yeah. That's true. That's true. And one thing, when you the wind turbines, everybody seems to know they're useless, but they don't seem able to stop them. There was this rather poignant story, I think, somewhere up in northern Scotland, where the Royal Ornithological Society had all gathered to watch the return of this extremely rare bird to Scottish shores. I don't know why you're laughing. This is tragic. The poor little fellow hasn't been seen in Scotland for generations, comes tweeting along, flies straight into the wind turbine and is in 2 million pieces all over the ornithologist's binoculars. And no matter what happens, nobody actually says, look, this stuff is useless. It kills a ton of things. It leaches into the ground. Why are we still doing this?
Well, it's about political will, and back to something I said earlier about people trying to appease their base. You know, in California, wind and solar is a big deal. I have solar on my home. I also have an electric car. The electric car is dead and sitting in the driveway. But the solar panels are still working. And I will tell you that the only reason I got solar panels was not because I was saving the earth by producing less carbon dioxide or bending to the political will of the people at Sacramento. I got it because it was the only way I could hedge against price increases on electricity. In the summer in California, they have these tiered pricing structures. And if you are a naughty boy and you use your air conditioning too much, you can be paying up to 80 cents per kilowatt hour for electricity, unless you have a solar panel, and then you're forgiven.
So
I'm not kidding.
So I just want to be sure I understand that, because that's like, so to get you to buy the solar panel, they impose punitive rates on electricity.
That's right.
And that way, everyone can say, well, there's been a 27% growth in solar panel sales in the last 3 years, and it's just you trying to avoid having your plug pulled by the state of California because you've maxed out your electricity allowance, basically.
Oh, they'll still keep the power on, but they will charge you to the point where you're having to finance your own electricity bill.
Yeah.
And one other thing to note about solar panels, they have an expected lifetime of about 20 to 25 years, depending on manufacturing. At some point in the not-too-distant future, there are going to be millions of solar panels that are no longer producing what they were supposed to be producing because they've aged, and they're going to have to be disposed of. They don't have a solution for that.
And what's interesting is the new California law that says you got to have them on your roof, whether you'll be able to just let them run. If you've got like a 50-year mortgage and your solar panel dies after 20 years, whether it'll be enough to have a useless solar panel stuck up on your roof for another 30 years. That'll still be enough to because a lot of this is such pointless virtue signaling. Let's have one final question from down here. Erin from, I think the lady over there. Is that right? Over there, yeah, just there, I think.
Yeah, what I find scary is now in the schools, they give you a bad mark in science if you don't go along with the climate change story. So then you don't get into the enriched program. So then you don't get into the elite university. So in the future, the scientists, they're going to have to all go along with this if they want to get into the university or the enriched program, whatever. So it's really. It reminds me of communism. You have to go along with the Marxist-Leninism to be able to go to university.
Yeah, I guess we've already seen that. One of the interesting things since I've been in this lawsuit with Michael Mann is often the pushback from the consensus figures is that if we say, oh well, this scientist says this and this scientist say that, they say, oh well, he's just an emeritus professor. He was fine back when he won the Nobel Prize for Physics in 1967, but he's basically semi-retired now, so who cares what he thinks? And at the same time, there were then this younger group of scientists just starting out who hadn't yet been intimidated into the consensus, and again would say occasionally dissident things. But there was this kind of big block of people from 30 to 70, in which there was a kind of serious consensus enforcement. And that's what all the 97% rubbish is about. It's basically to tell you you're a weirdo if you disagree with us. And this seems basically unscientific, Ross. It doesn't. The idea of an enforced, the idea that a consensus, a scientific theory is correct according to whether 17 or 12 people advance it, and it gets more correct the more people who advance it, and eventually it becomes inviolably correct. That doesn't actually that seems something new in science.
It has happened before, but the stories don't usually have a happy ending.
No.
For instance, in nutrition and diet issues, where you have essentially an obesity epidemic because the scientific community had a rock-solid consensus that just happened to be exactly the opposite of what they should have been advising people on. It does raise, well, Steve had mentioned a Maoist scientist and this whole feeling of Maoism about the school system, that kids are in a kind of ongoing re-education camp. Even before they got their education, they're in re-education camp.
Yeah, it's re-education without education, which is like taking it to the next level. It's.
I got into. I published an op-ed a few months ago on the extreme weather issue, and a lot of it was just reporting what was in IPCC reports and those mainstream reports that over and over reach the conclusion that there aren't really trends in extreme weather, and these big events, when you look at long time series, today is not exceptional, and got a lot of positive feedback, but also a lot of negative feedback. And while the negative feedback was pouring in, a friend of mine who grew up in Eastern Europe came to talk to me, and he said that when I was growing up, the political correctness in the Soviet Union was really bad. Like, everybody was afraid to talk about it. But then he added, but people think that the Soviets imposed it on us. They didn't. We imposed it on ourselves. He said, we just stopped being willing to talk and challenge what we were being heard. And we knew that at that point we were imposing it on ourselves. So it was his way of saying, keep writing what you're writing. And I think the same message goes for everyone here. If you let it, no one's going to impose it on you unless you impose it on yourself.
Yeah, yeah. That's a fine point and an excellent one on which to end. These three gentlemen, in their different ways, have all refused to succumb to that, and none of them sought the notoriety they found themselves with among the big climate enforcers, and all of them have withstood an amazing barrage from the 97% consensus enforcers that I think most of us would have a real difficulty withstanding. As you know, Anthony gets attacked every day of the week by people. He's the soul of geniality, the idea that yet if you were to read the climate consensus website, it's all about how he's spewing his hatred on this, he's spewing his denialism, he's a complete non-spewer. and there's a slight trend, but it's about in the scheme of things. It's not a dramatic hockey stick spew straight up into the stratosphere. Just a very slight dribble that's consistent with previous records. So these three guys are actually three of the bravest people in a field in which, for many, discretion has become not just the better part of valor, but necessary to survive without being attacked and pilloried. So we owe these three men a great debt. Ross McKitrick, Steve McIntyre, Anthony Watts, thank you very much. Three quarters of us were part of a book called Climate Change: The Facts, which became it became a big environmental bestseller. It used to give me a laugh to look at the Amazon environmental bestsellers, and our little book would be #1 on there, and Michael Mann's book on his hockey stick was in at big hit position number 73. So we had a great time doing that. So 3/4 of us will be signing the book, I think, somewhere that away immediately after the show. Steve wasn't part of the book. He said, he could survive a lot of things, but he wasn't going to be associated with the three of us. So he said, no way. But the rest of us will be back there signing that book a little later, and I hope right after the show, and I hope you'll want to come along if you don't yet have a copy and pick it up. That's it from us, and we will see you next time. Thank you.